Good afternoon and welcome to our Q3 Manufacturing Outlook webinar. My name's Richard Austin. I'm BDO's Head of Manufacturing. Yesterday saw the launch of our latest Q3 Make UK and BDO Manufacturing Outlook report. Hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at it. Some of the information from it is quite interesting. We'll be picking up on that as we go through the webinar today. One through the lens of James Brougham, who's Make UK's Economist, but also in conversation with Stephen Phipson, who's the Chief Executive of Make UK as well. But in terms of the information that's come out from the latest report, it's quite interesting. It's probably the best way of putting it. The first 2 quarters of this year have shown good and positive growth and prospects for manufacturing. Our Q3 report actually has shown some of that growth and optimism starting to flatten off. So there has been a dampening in terms of investment intentions. There's been a dampening in terms of order books, etc. So we'll be exploring that a little bit more. As I said, Make UK Senior Economist James Brougham will be providing some thoughts and some reportage associated with the report, but also to look at, why may that have happened, what specifically may be driving this, etc. Also, as I say, we're delighted to be joined by Stephen Phipson. Clearly, a lot is going on in government, a lot is going on more broadly around manufacturing, and I'll be in conversation with Stephen around some of the opportunities and challenges that we can expect to see and to react to over the next few months and probably the next 12 months, etc. Clearly, within that, there's there's a budget that will be coming through sometime in November, and there's a general election that may well have some colour to add to the world of manufacturing as well. The other thing I'd like to do is just to raise, in terms of our latest Outlook report, we have a spotlight on policy and manufacturing investment, which hopefully you will find particularly interesting. And that also covers off some of the areas around foreign business frameworks, etc., and how the UK can respond to global impacts on manufacturing more generally. As usual, you should have a box at the bottom of your screen today. If you have any questions, we will be picking those up at the end of our webinar today. So please do contribute and raise any questions, and we'll come to those at the end of the session. With that, I will hand over to James Brougham, who will pick up an overview of the results from the Q3 Manufacturing Outlook report. Over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Richard, and good afternoon, everybody. As Richard's already mentioned, I'm James Brougham, co-author of this report. Some of you may have even seen our last quarter's report as well, where perhaps we were far higher spirits. I think Richard mentioned or hinted at this already. This quarter is represented by perhaps sort of missed expectations. Certainly seeing as we'd seen the data as well back our opinion from the start of the year right the way through, really till we collected the data for this report only about 3 weeks ago, showing that we were going on a track for consistent but moderate positivity. And despite the headwinds of course, continued pressure from central bank rates, not just in the UK, but really across the US and Europe as well, we weren't really seeing the effects bite. But what's happened in that relatively short intervening period now between the second quarter of the year and the third quarter of the year is just that, is that cost of capital, the cost of money, really coming into bite, and indeed having the effect that it was designed to do by central banks to slow up across the board that economic activity in order to get inflation down towards target. So if I could have the next slide, please. I'll start by giving a brief overview of the key findings, and then we'll go in and interrogate some of the individual metrics with some charts, which should add some color to what I'm about to say now. So, as mentioned, that slowdown, our output and orders metrics, and all of our metrics are based on a balance of change principle. So the numbers I'm about to show you aren't to be interpreted in terms of absolute terms. If you see a 10% balance figure, that does not indicate a 10% growth or decline in output. It indicates a balance, a proportion of the industry which is seeing either a growth or decline in that given metric. But anyway, despite that, the order and output metrics are pretty much flat. So certainly not plummeting into negativity, but really subverting expectations that were set only 3 months ago by the industry themselves and not even our forecast. And we'll see that illustrated on a graph in a couple of slides' time as well. The balance between UK orders and export orders, the tide has effectively gone out between them. So there's not a real story between exports hurting harder or domestic orders filling up their place. That overall activity has come down. One of the major points in this quarter's report is the relationship between prices and margins. We'd long been seeing elevated price setting behavior from the industry. And of course, while that was probably much to the behest of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee moving exactly to counter that, what it was allowing is breathing space for the sector to recoup margins that had been in decline for about a year and a half. And we'll also see that illustrated on a graph. Hiring activity in our later stage has also come to a pause. What's bizarre is we have vacancies remaining quite high, and intentions to employ only last quarter were quite high as well. Now, all of a sudden, hiring activity over the past quarter has come to a stop, which feeds into that narrative that the sector is moving into more of a battle footing or a capital-aware, liquidity cautious position to make sure it doesn't overextend its balances at the moment. But I think perhaps the silver lining here with everything and a lot with many other metrics is we see the expectation for the fourth quarter rather curiously from the sector is positive, or should I say more positive than one would expect given the sudden flattening across most of the metrics we've seen here in this third quarter. And because of this confidence that's built in, seems to still be built into the sector at the moment, despite this quarter's mild flattening. And I won't say negativity because you'll see the graphs haven't gone all the way down yet, is our forecast is at 0.8% for manufacturing GVA output growth for 2023 and 0.1% for 2024. So not too exciting there in the forecast, really arguably a flat forecast for 2023, still in the decimal point range, and really a pedestrian forecast for 2024 as well. A not too dissimilar story for our forecast for wider UK GDP growth at 0.5% for 2023 and 0.4 for 24. So now we'll go and look at some illustrations along with these metrics. If I could have the next slide, please. And first of all, starting with output and orders. Now, these bars, if I'll just move this out of the way, there we go. Now, so these bars, the red representing the balance of change for output, the orange representing the balance of change for orders. If I just draw your attention to the right-hand side, where you see 2023 Q3 on the x-axis on the bottom, you'll see that actually you can barely see the red bar and particularly the orange bar as they just flipping around the zero mark there. Now, it speaks to what I was mentioning at the start in the 2023 Q1 and 23 Q2. You can see the balances for output and orders there were moderately positive and consistent. And you can see even compared, if we cast your eyes back towards the middle of the graph or 21 Q3, you can see nowhere near as high during the degree of activity that we saw in that post-COVID recovery period, which is, of course, what that 2021 start of 2022 period, those elevated bars represent. But we'll see in a couple of slides time just how much this quarter missed the expectation. So the expectation was set to be pretty much those same figures again. So the 23 Q1, 23 Q2 figures, we were expecting that again. And that was driving a lot of narrative and also backed up anecdotally by our members and conversations we've had with the manufacturers, which is it seemed that the daily firefighting had come to an end, whether it be the cooling in the wholesale energy price and since the start of the year, a significant easing in supplier lead times, which is allowing a lot of unlocked value and a lot of, shall we say, dead goods and dead intermediate goods sat in warehouses to carry on their journey through the market. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is the breakdown of that orders bar from the previous slide, breaking down UK orders and export orders. I've just got this here really to illustrate that there doesn't seem to be much of a story this quarter coming out between the differential between UK orders and export orders. So if I just cast your attention to just the section left of the green boxed bar, you'll see the orders are both pretty much equally in just minor negativity there. I wouldn't read too far into whether it's just positive or just negative. Despite one might being invited to conclude on what that might mean. But here's the green box, is what I was saying is curious at the start. The way you see a green box, that is manufacturers' expectations. So we, as part of the survey work and part of the field work, we ask firms, what they expect for the given metric, what they're expecting to come down the line for their business in the next 3 months. And of course, with such a short-term request, many businesses are able to see, in that short term with a relative degree of confidence. And we see here a bizarre quantity of confidence, given what we understand is driving these other metrics down, that by the fourth quarter, the industry seems to think that actually we'll be back to that moderate positivity again. Now, there's two things to take away here, of course, is that sat where we're sat, we find that unlikely, given the driving force of this is the general suppressive effects of the rising base rate across both the UK and many Western economies having its desired impact. And of course, we don't expect that to abate. We don't expect a sudden bounce back in that base rate back down to cheap money days by the fourth quarter of this year. And so because of that, we're quite cautious of the sector's expectation that it will return to that moderate positivity again next quarter. Could I have the next slide, please? And so what this graph is detailing is that combination between that expectation and reality. And I know it's quite a lot at the moment, but don't worry, I'll describe it quite clearly. Again, as usual, I'll take the right-hand side as a case in point. What these bars represent are output and orders respectively in dark orange and orange, and the dots represent output and orders as well. And what the bars represent are the expectations that were set in the prior quarter. So if we look at the far right-hand column, you'll see 23 Q3. The bars are the expectations that were set by the sector in the second quarter of the year, so last quarter. And the dots are what's actually come to pass. So it's an interesting check and balance to see effectively, was there a shock in that intervening period between only the space of 3 months? Or is there a degree of consistency? Because if the sector is able to accurately predict what's coming down in 3 months, that's tantamount to a degree of business environment consistency. So if we look at the penultimate column, you'll see that actually it's pretty much spot on. The bars are there and the dots landed pretty much where they are. And what we have here in 23 Q3 is the inverse. We had a very high expectation for output and orders relative to what's come in today. And your eyes are probably drawn as well to 2023 Q1, which is the third column along, which is the inverse, where that was at the turn of the year. And you might remember a lot of talk around the UK heading into low and slow recession. It was quite a dark time for forecasting and then the outlook for both the wider economy and the sector at the turn of the year, sort of Christmas time. And actually what happens is the sector did a lot better than expected. And that's revealed in that combination of data there in 23 Q1, where we see the bars are just kissing below the zero line, but actually the dots are far above them. And if we could have the next slide, please. Prices and margins. So a really important point about the past 2 years is how margins have effectively been under assault for the sector, despite pricing activity having been at record-breaking figures. Quite a curious phenomenon indeed. So it'll be quite evident here when we look at the right-hand side in general. You see a big mountain of red and orange bars, and what these bars represent is manufacturers' price-setting behavior. So not their input prices, but their own business's price-setting behavior. So for UK prices and export prices in red and orange, respectively. The lines represent UK margins and export margins. And so what you can see here quite clearly is from around 22 Q1, which is effectively the last quarter of the graph, you can see that the prices remain very, very quarter-to-quarter price setting activity is at its highest. And actually, despite this data set only showing you about 8 years here, this data in its form goes back 30 years. And it's the highest balance figures we've had for prices pretty much consecutively in that 30-year history. So, but at the same time, how can this be? We have margins declining. So how can prices be rising at the fastest ever rate in terms of their manufacturers setting behavior, yet it's still not recouping margins? And of course, what this is that the rate of input costs, whether it be energy, product, commodity, labor costs, of course, was outpacing their ability to recoup margins, despite price setting behavior quarter to quarter being at record-breaking figures. So quite a shocking phenomenon, of course, and quite a lot of the rationale what has driven central banks to act as they have, to really turn the thumb screws up on bank rates. But nevertheless, since about 23 Q1, so moving now towards the right of the graph where you see the lines recover, we saw a phenomenon where input prices were cooling. We've had the cooling of the energy wholesale rate, but critically as well, we've had an easing in international supply chain lead times and then vis-a-vis pricing as well. But there was little sentiment for the sector to reduce its pricing in line as perhaps traditional market theory would dictate, for the reason of the bathtub of margin lines we see there, because the sector was looking to recoup those margins that it had lost over the past year and a half, 2 years. Unfortunately now, well, depending on which side of the fence you sit on, whether you sit on the bank's fence and you're interested in controlling whole economy inflation, or whether you sit as an individual manufacturer, that breathing room has now gone in order to continue to set high prices and finally see margins come up to roost. So what you're seeing here at the bottom, you see the lines, not the bars, were just coming up if high price setting behavior was going to continue. And we were even talking about last quarter and the first quarter that we're very likely to see margin recovery move into positivity, at least growth in margins, by the third or perhaps fourth quarter of this year. And now that prospect's looking weaker. So if we look at the green boxed bar, that's the price setting behavior expectation for next quarter, which we perhaps think is over positive in the sense of the scale. So we think it's likely to be even lower than those bars. And the margins, the expectation is that we'll just start creeping into above zero territory. But given that we are on the sort of downside risk side of expectation, that we think the sector's expectation this quarter is perhaps over positive for the next quarter, we think that actually margins may well remain just in negativity in the fourth quarter of the year, and too we'll see continued lower in terms of a reduced amount of growth in price setting behavior, not a decline, the rate of growth to decrease. The next slide, please. But this ties into altogether, of course, with confidence, and it'll follow that you've seen, I've described perhaps with a weary eye, why is confidence so high, and for the expectation in terms of, well, orders are going to recover next quarter according to the sector. We're expecting not a continued decline in price setting behavior according to the sector. And now we see confidence. So despite these core metrics of, say, output and orders having turned flat and turned flat in such a short space of time, in only the space of 3 months, confidence remains rather unknocked. So we see here the orange line representing the sector's view on the overall UK economy, and then the red line being the aggregate figure for the sector's view on their own firms and businesses. Very normal for them to be separate, but very little gap. Now, if you were to crack out a microscope or a magnifying glass, might consider that we've seen a slight decline in UK economic conditions relative to the previous quarter. You can see it's just tailing down. And likewise for business performance, just tailing up. But that's certainly within the margin of error indeed. And could I have the next slide, please? So this is the final core metric of the manufacturing outlook work, employment and investment. So a cornerstone, I think, of the findings is, of course, employment activity having turned flat in an environment where the labor shortage and skill shortage is still pervasive, and it's indeed illustrated by ONS data when we look at the vacancies rate. Now, the vacancies rate within manufacturing has come down fairly consistently from its high of July last year, where it peaked at around 4 jobs vacant per every 100 employed. Now, the long run average for this figure is 2. The long run average from about 1995 is about 2, actually 1.8 to be technical. And so at that point, we could say, the demand for labor in July last year was twice as hot as it has been in that long run average. Now, as of today, it's at about 2.9. So it's still 50% higher in terms of if we're proxying the vacancy rate within the sector for demand for labor. But of course, that's not immune to the short-term sentiment that our survey data reveals here, which is the red bar just to the left of the green bar, that's reported employment activity growth on balance from the sector in the past 3 months. And you can see it's pretty much zero. If you can just see there's a slither beneath, but it's pretty much flat after 2 quarters of relatively consistent growth. Again, we have the rather curious green bar that expects that actually, no, it'll resume in the fourth quarter, which ties in across all the other metrics, that there seems to be a degree of confidence that we might hesitate to say, but a degree of overconfidence built up in the sector for its prospects in the fourth quarter of the year. And finally, the orange line, I should say, tracking 12-month ahead investment intentions, still well and below where you can see the peak of the mountain, really, which came around 2021 in this time series, in that post-COVID recovery period, sort of in a holding pattern, had dipped in the second quarter and has come up slightly in the third quarter. but not enough of a significant change, nor a consistent one driven by underlying metrics for us to really get excited about for the sector, about where we think investment intentions are going in the next quarter. Given, as I've detailed, I think probably again and again, the combination of our flattened data now and then this expectation for improvement from a sector that we don't think the fundamentals of what's driving this business environment are going to change, leads us to be quite cautious about where we think investment is going, investment intentions are going in the short term for this sector. So you can have the next slide, please. This is simply a visualization of the forecast I mentioned at the start. So really looking at the middle and right-hand side sections, 0.8% growth expected from manufacturing GDA, I should say, or output in 2023, with a far more pedestrian and flat 2024. A similar story for GDP. I think that's perhaps, despite not being a particularly exciting figure in the manufacturing figures, it's perhaps the more damning outlook about there are little prospects for growth really right the way into 2024. Even though some of the most acute pressures that have recently been infamously a pressure on the sector in the past year, chiefly energy price spiraling and energy price spiraling, labor shortages, and indeed supply chain frictions, a lot of which have eased significantly from their peak of their pressure. Yet still, the outlook is not one of significant growth. We'll move on to the final slide, please. So this is exactly the same as the first slide. I know I've talked a lot, so I just have this here to really give you two things to take away. And the two things are, it's flattened rather unexpectedly. The driver of this has been the Bank of England's the rising cost of capital, but not just here, right the way across Europe, our biggest trading partner, and indeed the US as well. And the second point is that a loss in terms of that opportunity on aggregate to regain margins, because pricing is now price setting behavior, I should say, is coming down, which was the breathing space that was allowing margins to grow. So thank you very much. I'll hand you back to Richard.
Thank you, James. Interesting set of results this quarter, as I was saying. It'll be interesting to see how things play out. Going forwards, I think the next quarter will kind of deliver some interesting outputs. But in terms of looking forward, understanding what the market's like, and also getting some input in terms of the trade body, the Make UK, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Stephen Phipson, who's the Chief Executive of Make UK. Stephen's been doing that job for what, 6-7 years now, since 2017?
Yeah, six years now, Richard. 6 years.
6 years. Stephen's always good value for money in terms of providing input and insight in terms of what's going on in the world of manufacturing. Clearly, being the head of a large trade body like Make UK gives Stephen a lot of insight, both in terms of manufacturers from all sizes, but also the broader context within which manufacturers work. Just a little bit, I'll spare you too many blushes, Stephen, but just a little bit about background about Stephen. So prior to being Chief Exec of Make UK, Stephen also worked in government as well as a senior civil servant across defence and also the Home Office as well. So understands the workings and machinations of central government as well, which is particularly helpful. And we'll kind of come on to some of that as we go through our conversation. And prior to that, Stephen's an out-and-out, cut him through the middle, and he'd say manufacturing across him. Spent 15 years with Smiths Group through a lot of acquisitions and activity that sat within that as president of Smith's detection team, and cut his teeth way back when, not that way back when, Steve, as an apprentice with Plessy Group. So he's sort of basically man and boy, a manufacturing man from start to finish, and now as I said, is Chief Exec of Make UK. So Stephen, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. What I'd like to do is just explore a few of the things that came out of the Make UK BDO quarterly update, but also some broader areas to discuss as well. clearly, from the output from the report this quarter, it's been an interesting time for manufacturers. I mean, historically, COVID's hit, mini budgets have affected us, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess the last 4 or 5 years has been pretty turbulent for manufacturers. It's been tough. It's been difficult to navigate through those challenges and react and respond appropriately. And I think UK manufacturers have done a fantastic job of doing that and have kind of underlined the resilience that we have in the sector. This year, first couple of quarters of this year, were kind of showing that things were starting to stabilize. Businesses were starting to get on a relatively stable footing again. But what we're seeing in the latest quarter is that some of those metrics have moved quite considerably. And clearly, listening to James, clearly interest rates and inflation have had quite a significant impact on that. And we're seeing that reflected in terms of pricing increases. Things are starting to dampen down. Employment intentions are moving somewhat as well, but investment itself is kind of still stable at the moment. And the intention going forwards is looking quite positive for the next quarter. Just in terms of that, slightly differing metrics across the board, and it'd be useful to sort of hear from you what your thoughts are, what you're hearing from your members as well in terms of what they're feeling and seeing, to sort of bring a bit of flavour to that. It'd be great to get your thoughts on that, Steve.
Sure, thank you, Richard. That's very good. I mean, James has given us a really good macro view of the sector, and of course, as ever in manufacturing, it's made up of lots of subsectors. So there's lots of differences depending on where you are in the manufacturing ecosystem. But there are some more common themes at a more detailed level. First of all, we shouldn't underestimate the challenge around energy prices. And what we have seen over the last couple of months, 2 or 3 months really, Richard, is a lot of smaller companies coming to the end of 3-year, 4-year fixes with their energy providers. And I can tell you a number of them, quite a few of them, probably a couple of hundred of them, phoning me up saying, I'm shocked. I've been told, I was watching the news and we'd said wholesale energy prices are coming down. I've just been told by my energy provider it's 15 times what I was paying last month for my new contract. And in lots of cases, that's causing financial difficulty for these companies. And it's a bit of a shock, to be honest with you. And I suppose we did see earlier in the year the change to the support mechanism the government provided for industry, which we fought very hard for last year. And as we started, and I know the wholesale prices come down, but what hasn't changed are all the additions that go onto people's energy bills. And of course, the other issue is that our energy costs, if you look at them in real terms, even at a wholesale level, are significantly higher than our European competitors. So all of a sudden, people are being shocked by that. Plus the fact, one of the beefs is that the energy market in the UK is unregulated, whereas the consumer one is regulated by Ofgem. So we've been talking a lot to Treasury about that because some people are seeing that as a shock. That's coming through quite strongly in very many of our regional boards. And we all thought that was dealt with, but it's not dealt with, Richard. And we're starting to see people saying, hold on a minute, or they're hearing stories and starting to be more cautious about cost control because they're worried they may be in the same boat. That is having a knock-on effect on investment, interestingly, positively, because what we are seeing is a lot of manufacturers investing in investments which give them energy efficiency. And digitization and the digital investments we're seeing very often, I mean, we've got about 4,500 companies on the Made Smarter pilot programs on the 5 pilots. And one of the great benefits of that is we're seeing a 30 to 40% improvement in energy efficiency as a result of digitizing processes. And that's attracting a lot of people to look at investments which are associated with energy efficiency, and digitization is one of those. So when you start to look at the bigger picture again and say, well, confidence in investment is quite strong, some of that is driven by people looking at ways of becoming more efficient in a very turbulent energy market that we've got in the UK at the moment. So we can start to understand, I think, some of the trends that James was talking about there. I think the other thing, Richard, which is a bit mysterious in the numbers, is around the hiring intentions of the labour market. And James mentioned that. I mean, it still is a fact that we've got an enormous amount of vacancies in the sector, something still approaching a 35-year high in terms of the skills we need in the sector. And of course, people are finding those skills are not available. They can't access EU markets. We're finding people going abroad, paying very high fees for visas, all sorts of things happening there, which is, a real issue. And in fact, one of our main asks of government at the moment, Richard, is around the skills agenda. It's a very, very concerning fact that if we look at the introduction of the apprentice levy in 2016, our apprentice starts this year are nearly 40% less than they were in 2016. I mean, that's almost criminal in an environment where we've got such shortages. So there are some really interesting interlinked activities there. There's a whole theme about cost control, energy efficiency. How do we make manufacturing more efficient? Labor constraints. Do we automate? Can we bring in that digitization area there? And people being a bit worried about uncertainty. What's going to happen in the budget? Where are we going next year? Is this high interest rate environment here to stay? Lots of those sorts of questions. But despite all of that, Richard, the sector, as you say, remains resilient and optimistic. And that's probably a little bit over-optimistic at the moment. But we are seeing it pull through in terms of some of these new investment projects that are going on, which I think is quite positive.
Yeah, it's interesting on that. Just on this sort of the energy side of things, we're also seeing that people are looking at initially, what can we do with what we currently got to improve our efficiency and our energy usage? So that's the first bit. The second bucket that people are looking at is what can we do in terms of investment that will give us a foreseeable return in a relatively quick period of time? So what can we do to invest that which will give me a short to medium term return that I can support and my lenders can support? And then the third bucket is the difficult one, right? Which is, look, if we want to make something that's structurally different, we want to actually move the dial, which means that we need to change the way we do things. That's the bit that I think we're hearing that companies are kind of slightly resistant or reticent to do that because there are other needs for their cash at the moment. So that's kind of what we're seeing with the kind of the buckets of investment and what we can do around improving, I guess, the yield or output of the business per kilowatt consumed, I suppose. It's an interesting one that, the sentiment is positive, right?
It is positive, but I think you're right. I mean, this is a way of it's typical engineering approach to a problem, isn't it? I mean, we have an issue with energy prices. They're high, they're a bit unstable, not sure where they're going. So why don't we try and engineer a solution for it? And that's often about improving your processes. And that's where I think a lot of the investment sentiment is coming from, Richard. Absolutely.
Yeah, completely. And just on that that investment side, I mean, we saw on those charts that the investment sentiment is still positive. It's not skyrocketed, that we saw, previously, but there is still investment intent sitting there. Obviously, investment intent relies on a number of different factors, one of which is having the cash to do it. But probably more important and strategically is thinking about what environment am I going to be investing into and how supportive is the environment for longer term investment that can actually allow businesses to radically improve their performance. And that kind of brings me on to the world of industrial strategy. And I know we've talked about it a few times. Clearly, historically, there have been a number of industrial strategies. The current government have decided to somewhat shy away from it. Clearly, there'll be some, there's a general election coming up. Maybe we can sort of dabble around that bit. But I think one of the things that came out from our report was that manufacturers in general, they want a level of certainty within which they can invest. I think with something like 22% think that basically effectively probably about three quarters of manufacturers are kind of saying, look, at the moment the environment's not right for us. We don't have that level of comfort to be able to invest into, and therefore raising capital or doing whatever else is going to be quite a tricky one. Clearly, you look at that, but on the other hand, I mean, even your information is sort of saying that we've just overtaken France in terms of our as being a manufacturing nation, and I think we're back up to number 8. So there's a number of movements going on. Firstly, it would be really good to understand, where manufacturing sits on the government agenda, the current government's agenda. but probably also where it may sit going forwards after general election. So it'd be worth exploring that a little bit. The other thing that would be interesting to think about is and explore is in terms of our relative competitiveness versus Europe versus China. Clearly, there are a number of pressures that are macro and are impacting all of us. But it'd be interesting to understand your views on that in terms of relative competitiveness across the UK. But maybe if we can touch on the more closer to home challenges or questions and insights that you might have on that would be really helpful.
Sure, great. Okay, well, that's the rest of the webinar then. We can talk about my favourite subject, which is industrial strategy, which is the one I am absolutely focusing on with all the ministerial meetings that we have on a weekly basis, Richard. I mean, first of all, let's look back. The 2010 industrial strategy we had so many benefits to it. We created the catapult network, we had sector deals, we had clarity in the long-term investments and where the priorities were for the country in terms of manufacturing, and a lot of inward investment was attracted as a part of that. And as of last year, of course, we cancelled the industrial strategy and we don't have one anymore. And what we are now seeing is a very fragmented approach by government, very often knee-jerk reactions. We're also seeing, and the effect of that, I mean, one thing I've been working on is with some of the inward investment programs that we've got and some of the projects that we've seen coming or potentially coming to the UK. And quite a few of the questions are around what is the plan here and is it investable? And I think the challenge which we keep pushing with the government is that the investments window for manufacturing is between 7 and 30 years. That's where it sits. So people typically around 10 to 15 years for most manufacturing investments. And you need stability, you need certainty, you need regulatory stability, you need to know where the priorities are we investing in the right things? And without that clarity, first effect we see is on inward investment, because people are saying, we're not quite sure where to go. The knock-on effect of that, of course, is also the Department for Education, which I have a lot of work on skills with, are not clear on what skills are required because there's no strategy about what the priorities are. So where are we going in terms of our education to support that growth in areas, because we don't have reactions, we don't have a clarity in the way forwards. And then we've seen, I mean, pleasingly, in many respects, we've seen some great investments being supported by government recently in one or two areas, but they are ad hoc, knee-jerk reactions. They're not part of a plan. Yeah. And so my argument to Treasury, which, by the way, they agree with, is that they're kind of the victims of whatever's happening today. They're not thinking about this in the context of a longer-term plan. So we absolutely need to get to a point where we've got a plan for the sector for the future. Now, in terms of where that sits on the government priorities, in this government's priorities, we were very pleased that Jeremy Hunt announced that advanced manufacturing is actually one of the 5 growth pillars of the economy going forwards. We have a great recognition. I mean, if we were having this conversation 3 years ago, Richard, they wouldn't have even talked about manufacturing. It's really quite pleasing to have manufacturing now as one of those growth pillars. But just saying that is not enough. We need a plan and we need certainty around that. Now, obviously, we're engaged with, we're apolitical, so we engage with the other parties as well. And actually, I was with Johnny Reynolds and Rachel Wees last week. We had a very good meeting, and they are fully committed to a long-term industrial strategy. They understand the principles of doing it. And by the way, people in government are as well, but they just don't seem to be able to agree what the shape of that looks like going forward. So absolutely vital that we have that longer-term plan. I don't expect before an election we're going to see something from this government around industrial strategy. If I'm candid about that, I think we're going to have a comprehensive approach committed to in the manifesto for Labour. I think that's going to be there, well, partly because we've been writing the documents for them, so I do hope that's in there. But I do expect one thing we will see, Richard, is at least some short-term efforts to try to support manufacturing from the government. And hopefully, in particular, we can start to address some of those skill shortages, because not only does that affect the output that we've got for manufacturing now, and our estimate is we're losing about 7 billion of output with the shortages we've got in manufacturing currently, but also it deters, it's another deterrent to inward investment, because people are often saying to us, if we're going to build a new factory, where are we going to get the skills from? I mean, what's the program? How's it joined up across government to provide local further education skills for the sorts of skills that we need in our factories we're going to invest in? So really, really important that we get this plan. It's absolutely our top art. It will be in our proposal manifesto to both parties. It's number one ask. It's almost number one ask at just about every meeting we go through. I think we argue sometimes about the name of it with government ministers, but there's a recognition that we need one. I just don't think we're in a position that this government's going to commit to it before the election. So absolutely vital, and really does impact on that ability to invest. We are known in this country for stability. When I was in the States recently, talking to American manufacturers about the Inflation Reduction Act, and actually they said to us, one thing we admire about the UK is you've got a stable regulatory environment. So let's hope this. I mean, their hope was political instability isn't going to change that in the UK, because that makes it a good long-term investment. Whereas in the States, they have the complete opposite, different regulations by state. They never know when they're going to change. And that stability comes from having a long-term plan. And that's what we need.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting. I mean, it's great that, you know, manufacturing now has a voice within government around the Treasury. I mean, it's clearly, you know, there are opportunities to sort of engage with all parties to sort of push the agenda for manufacturers, and making sure that they have that level of certainty and comfort that they can invest into, which gives them the ability to sort of make those longer term decisions. Just moving on to sort of the more global view of things, right? So as I was saying, that, you know, we've moved up the leaderboard to 8th globally in terms of manufacturing output. So I think we've leapfrogged France. But just in terms of what's going on globally at the moment, clearly, you know, there are macro elements that play here which affect manufacturers not only in the UK but across the board as well. You know, China output's starting to sort of slump somewhat. Germany, talking to a number of our German colleagues, the view there is that, you know, that's the powerhouse of manufacturing in Europe. However, there's been underinvestment for quite a period of time within Germany as well, and the competitive advantages they have, especially around motor manufacturing, is starting to kind of to wane somewhat. It'd be interesting to get your views on where we sit in the world relative to other manufacturing nations.
So I think some general comments. First of all, we are seen as the innovators, Richard. The big advantage the UK's got is this is where all the innovation happens. Even talking to the big Americans, as I mentioned in my visit recently, they would say, we've got the scale and the money, you've got the ideas. So they often come and invest in the UK because of the innovation. And that's one thing the government has done very well. Our innovation programme through UKRI, Innovate UK, the Catapult Network is world class. There's no doubt about that. We are very, very good at coming up with the clever ideas. We're not very good at commercialising them. And that's been the challenge throughout my career, and is even more so now because we have a big emphasis on innovation and what we can do there. So we are seen as the innovators. In some areas, we have been so slow. I mean, I do worry about the automotive sector. It's great to see the Tata announcement about the gigafactory, but you've got to set that in context. I mean, we're talking about now that there are now 300 operational gigafactories around the world, and there's another 190 being built, and we've just decided to do the Tata one. I mean, you know, I really worry that we are falling way behind there, for example, and it's such a good opportunity. And we can see that, you know, there has been, up until the recent stats, a real growth in what we're doing with EVs. So we are, again, it's around, can we get the scale of investment and can we have the right environment to make those investments here? There's still a great appetite for inward investment, but I think what we're seeing is that at the moment, people are worried that it's a bit disjointed. I mean, if I come, can I get the skills? What are you doing about the energy price? Where's that fitting into things? You're going to change government. Does that mean a complete change of direction? Not quite sure. So what we do see is a lot of people just putting things on hold at the moment. I mean, Germany's relative, to be honest with you. It still is a powerhouse of manufacturing. And in the M&A rounds we saw earlier in the year, when we saw what was happening in mergers and acquisitions in manufacturing, the Germans were playing a very big part in buying up lots of small-scale startups in the UK that had all the innovation and taking them back to Germany. There was a big trend of that happening earlier. It's slowed up now, but we saw them coming over, getting ready for the next generation. We've got particularly good innovation around net zero programs at the moment, lots of technology coming out of the government programs on hydrogen, SMR, supply chains, those sorts of things where people are interested in trying to grab hold of those technologies, as we've seen with the Americans with the Inflation Reduction Act, trying to attract the investment to go to the US on that basis. I would also, talk a bit more. I mean, an optimistic note here is around supply chains. When we look at China, we've seen quite a few of the JVs being unwound now in China. We've seen a big boost to, I would call it nearshoring, where people have been moving Chinese production out of China and moving it to places like Turkey. We've seen a big growth in Turkey being a replacement supplier for UK supply chains. We're also hearing a lot of discussion about moving those supply chains back to the UK, which presents us with a great opportunity to do it. I think people are reluctant to take that next step after nearshoring, because where are you going to get the people from? What's going to happen in the longer term? Where's the energy cost and all those sorts of things? So, again, if there's some certainty around the plan there, and also some incentives, which is what we're putting in our budget submission about, investment incentives around the areas that we want to attract to this country, which are primarily around the net zero technologies. If we look at that, then we can have a really good opportunity there to, really reshore a lot of that manufacturing activity that further down the supply chain that went away 20, 30 years ago. So there's a really good optimistic point. I mean, I was talking to a very large manufacturer who I won't name recently, who've got a team of 20 procurement people scouring the UK to see if they can bring things back and give them to UK suppliers. Great. I mean, we're now starting to run lots more meet the buyer type exercises with local clusters of manufacturing to try to re-establish those supply chain links that we saw before. But the investment needs incentivization and it needs stability and clarity. And I think that's the role the government takes in doing that. So I think we're in a good opportunity. It's a great opportunity for the UK, Richard. There's lots of those things that are very positive for us, but it needs to be set in the context of having a clear plan and everything joined up to support that growth in our sector going forwards. And that's what we're battling for.
Yeah, totally. The other thing that you picked up on earlier was around the investment side, was around digitization as a driver for efficiency and performance. I mean, if we can sort of pick up on that for a few minutes, just to sort of really sort of dig into it a bit, just to really understand what are we really talking about in terms of digitization, because that can mean different things to different people.
Yeah, it can.
And sometimes you can put the digitized sort of banner across stuff, and sometimes it's a slightly tenuous. But I mean, it'd be good to get your thoughts in terms of what you're seeing with some of your members around what they're actually doing and how they're doing it, and what the I guess the outcome of them doing it is.
So you're right. It means lots of different things to different people. And if I look at the Made Smarter program so far and the 5 pilots we've got in operation at the moment, that's covered around 4,000-ish SMEs. If you look at it in total, about 2,500 live projects. And there's a couple of really important things that come out of that. And it's important because I've been sitting on the Prime Minister's Energy Efficiency Task Force, and it comes to the main recommendation we're making to that task force. First of all, what we're finding with SMEs is these are not big projects, Richard. These are not digitizing and changing the whole factory into a factory of robots. Very often, these are small-scale improvements. This is putting sensors on CNC machines, harvesting data, reconfiguring, maybe putting in a low-cost robot, and doubling the output from your existing assets. That's been the most effectual way of starting the journey on I4 or digitization in these factories. And many of the projects that have been done that way. Very often people they've been running their injection molding shop for the last 30 years. They have no idea that you can put a robot on now, pick off the pieces, you can collect data from the machine in a very low cost way. We saw one recently where a machine shop put the sensors on the CNC machines cost £500.
Yeah.
And within 2 months, they'd got something like about £40,000 of return. I mean, it was really staggering to see how much more productivity improvement there was as a result of applying some of these techniques. But what we've learned there, Richard, is that most of these SMEs, and of course 95% of manufacturers are small businesses, haven't got time to be sitting on websites trying to learn how to do this stuff for themselves. What's been most effectual is by having advisors going out, knocking on doors and showing them in real time, not in the digital space, how to apply those techniques to their machines and their processes. That's been important. So one of the big things that comes out of the Energy Efficiency Task Force is that we make Made Smarter a national program. First of all, we allocate funding to do that. It's 50-50 funded by government effectively. And then the rest of the project work comes from industry when you get a project. But also, most importantly, we employ advisors. We almost re-established what we used to have in this country, which was the Manufacturing Advisory Service years ago. And now we call it the, whatever you want to call it, the Energy Efficiency Advisory Service, or the Made Smarter or Made Greener Efficiency, so I think is one of the ideas. Because by digitizing, you can absolutely make a big effect on energy efficiency. And if you look at the government's target, which is a 15% reduction in energy consumption for the country by 2030, 40% of that comes from manufacturing. So the big element is actually all these SMEs using their processes and making them more efficient. The answer to many of those questions is digitization. So the two things are linked inextricably together. There is a route forwards for doing it. It just needs a bit of a national program coming, I would say, from government. The other thing I would say about digitization, to give you another practical example, is the labor shortage. So if you have factories which were reliant on low-cost manual labor to do some operations, and food and drink manufacturing in some areas is a good example of that, what we have seen over the last 18 months or so is a big increase in them automating their processes. One way around it is to automate out the labor requirements that you've got. And that's been a big push, a big trend we've seen in doing that. The challenge then is the skills they need are a different skill set. It's not the manual workers anymore. Now they need people that can code and people that can do data analytics. And of course, that's in short supply as well. So whilst there has been a wave of automation to try to adjust the manufacturing process to cope for labour shortages, it's now throwing up needs for reskilling, upskilling, digital skills, none of which are at the moment on the DfE list of things to do. So we're trying to encourage them to go down that route as well. So there's some examples of really where digital is so important for the manufacturing sector, I would say.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, we're seeing the same thing. It's what can we do to help us understand our processes better in the most efficient way, where we can apply some sort of data analytics and KPIs to really understand how can we squeeze as much out of what we currently do as possible. It's doing stuff in a smart way, having some process associated with it, and the ability to measure the outcome of changes that you make, right? And you know, we're seeing a lot of businesses coming out with some of those, line side detection mechanisms to really pick off, quite straightforward information, but being able to do it in a more timely fashion, a more reliable way for people to be able to look at the information. Then the question is, so what? So I've got some information, what do I do with it? And I totally agree with you. The way that people manufacture will change, it has to change. And a big part of that is the skill set associated with it. And a big part of that is, it is your data analysts and your computer science people as well. I think there's something came out in the paper, was it last week or the week before, talking about a massive uptick in people going into university to look at computer sciences, etc., and analytics as part of that, mainly because they are in short supply. The demand's going up, and what you can expect when you come out of universities is quite a healthy pay packet. So some of this is going to be driven.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's another complaint we're seeing at the moment from lots of the larger companies saying to us they're taking on graduates, but they haven't got anything like the skills they need to work in a digital manufacturing environment. And then they have to spend another year trying to retrain them or upskill them a bit to give them the additional skills, because the curriculum's not keeping pace with the change that's going on in the manufacturing environment. That's one issue. Another issue, another large manufacturer was saying to us that they realized they needed data analytics engineers, but they had no idea how to write the job description. So they had to actually work with a local university to write the job description for these new types of engineers that they needed. And it's that sort of collaboration that we need to recognize. I mean, and obviously they've then got a large part to play in their local community to help the smaller companies understand what those requirements are, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's a lot to play in terms of the change of dynamics around that and the use of digitization, but at a local level to be able to drive that performance.
It doesn't have the messages, I think,
yeah.
Richard. It doesn't have to be the big 3D printing machine. We are talking about mostly small increments of things.
Yeah.
Where, I mean, we had one recently, a very famous fine furniture manufacturer, and Fred spent his whole 35 years just before retirement sewing on buttons into the quilting in a certain way, and he was perfect at it, but he was retiring, and they'd never used any kind of digital techniques. And we had them along to one of the catapults, and they showed them how to digitize the process so that Fred became the robot. And actually now the business carries on, and you'll know the name. I won't say the name, but now it's a robotic digital process and not Fred doing it.
A digital Fred. A digital Fred. I'm conscious of time. The other thing, just sort of wind things up before we kind of quickly cover off some of the Q&As that will have come through. Just more broadly, in terms of looking forwards now, opportunities. If we look at that in terms of opportunities for UK manufacturing, just your views on that. Where are the areas that you'd be putting your well-earned pound into at the moment in terms of looking for where growth is going to come from?
I think what we're seeing, Richard, by far the biggest opportunity in many areas is everything around the decarbonisation and net zero agenda. I mean, the technologies that are coming out now, whether you look at trying to produce in this country wind turbines rather than outsourcing them to other countries, and you look at some of the technological developments like the blade manufacturing up in the northeast and what we're doing there, the use of new composite materials coming out of the National Composite Centre, and all the net zero. For example, there's a whole industry being created about recycling carbon fibre. Carbon fibre is essential for a lot of the net zero technologies. It's made from oil. It's a terrible process. And at the moment, when we finish with it, we put it in a landfill. It's a disaster. But now, guess what? We've got a whole range of new companies now able to recycle, deconstruct, rewind, and reuse carbon fibre. Those sorts of new industries are out there. We've got 2 years ago, we had no hydrogen fuel cell members in Make UK. I've got 120 now. These are brand new technologies, and their supply chains around them are enormous. We're going to build a gigafactory in Somerset. There will be a whole supply chain around those types of technologies. If I talk to any of the car makers, they're still sourcing, the non-battery parts of EVs, regenerators, etc., from European sources. We've got a brilliant opportunity to transition people making traditional engines and normal transmission parts to EV components, and some of those are starting to do that now. Carbon capture, usage and storage is going to create 100,000 manufacturing jobs. We just saw the Tata Steel announcement, which unfortunately results in 3,000 traditional jobs around a blast furnace being lost. But setting up an electric arc furnace and the industry around supporting that, and one thing they haven't determined yet is the growth in new jobs that weren't there before around supporting that kind of new process. That's going to have regenerative steam in there, for example, turbines around doing regeneration of steam that comes off the steel plant. It's got all of the supply chain around carbon capture, usage and storage, really lots and lots and lots of new jobs. We're going to create hundreds of thousands of new jobs there. And so I'll give you hundreds of examples now of smaller companies and larger companies participating in that agenda. And that's the market trying to work out what we can do using the brilliant innovation we've got in this country. And I really do hope that when we get to the budget, we're going to start to see tax incentives around investing in some of these new technologies in factories, because at the moment, on the large companies, they're often competing projects with projects that give them a short-term return, and they're losing out on them because there's no incentive on the tax to do the green incentive or the energy efficiency incentive rather than the traditional manufacturing investments. We are going to create hundreds of thousands of new jobs. There's going to be a transition, and that comes into plain sight when you look at that Tata Steel example last week. But the new industries of tomorrow are going to be around decarbonisation. There's no escaping that. And manufacturing is a solution to most of those issues. So really, whilst we're going to have to go through lots of different iterations and changes, That is a great source of growth for the future. And because we're so strong in innovation, I think we've got, I mean, you name it. Commercial aviation is going to be revolutionized. The hydrogen industry is going to be something that's going to crop up. We've got to make, when I was sitting on this task force, we need 450,000 engineers to install new boilers in homes over, when we get to 2030. I mean, the scale of it is enormous. So people should be thinking about that as a really good opportunity for manufacturing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Your point around hydrogen technology. It's kind of taken, to use a very bad comparison, on the back burner somewhat compared to obviously the world of batteries. But the potential of it is huge. And,
well, at the moment, Richard, at the moment, the government is concentrated on the fuel side. So all the money from government has gone onto the fuel production. So how do you get from, grey hydrogen to blue hydrogen to green hydrogen, that sort of thing. But it's all the downstream stuff, the use of that hydrogen. That's where the big growth is. Yeah,
I know it's gonna be fascinating. There will be jobs out there that don't exist right now.
Absolutely,
they'll be radically different, and there'll be high value jobs for the country as well. So I think there's a huge positive to take from that. We just need to make sure we've got the right bits of the jigsaw puzzle in place to be able to maximise what we can from that.
And a plan, a strategy, and a plan is what we need. That's what we need.
There we go. Thanks for underlining that, Steve.